thought for a couple of seconds. In a very short span of time, something that was once seen as a secondary support tool has started moving into some of the most dangerous tasks on the battlefield in Ukraine. At first glance, this may look like just another adaptation in a war where both sides are constantly searching for ways to survive under skies filled with drones and on ground filled with risk. But what makes this development more significant is that Ukraine is no longer using UGVs as a few scattered support devices. They are beginning to appear more often, across more missions, and in places where soldiers once had to carry the full burden themselves. And when that happens, the story is no longer about a few new machines or a few isolated tasks. It begins to look like a sign that Ukraine may be changing how ground warfare itself is being conducted, in a way that could become much harder for Russia to deal with over time. So what exactly has Ukraine done with UGVs? And why could this become one of the most notable shifts in the war so far? Let's take a closer look with military force. March 2026 marked the moment when Ukraine's ground robots stopped looking like a niche experiment and started looking like a real battlefield capability. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Ukrainian forces carried out more than 9,000 missions with unmanned ground vehicles in March alone, while the total from the start of 2026 to early April reached nearly 24,500 missions. Those figures matter because military change is not measured only by invention. It is measured by repetition, routine, and scale. When a system is used thousands of times across 1 month, it is no longer a prototype on the edge of combat. It has entered daily operations. The trend behind the March number is just as important. In November 2025, Ukraine recorded about 2,900 UGV missions. By March 2026, that figure had passed 9,000. This was not one sudden spike caused by a single emergency or one temporary success. It was a steady climb over several months, which suggests that field commanders were seeing practical results and expanding use accordingly. In wartime, a rise like that usually means a new tool has moved beyond improvisation and into accepted planning. The expansion in the number of units using UGVs makes the picture even clearer. In November 2025, 67 units were already using ground robots. By March 2026, the figure had climbed to 167. The growth also spread across different types of formations, including medical, assault, operational, and air assault units. That matters because it shows UGVs were not tied to one narrow mission or one specialist culture. They were being absorbed across the force, which is a stronger sign of institutional change than a headline mission count alone. Another important point is that Ukraine was not simply counting machines. It was building a system around them. The Ministry of Defense said Delta was being used to plan missions, record outcomes, and rate units by completed tasks. That detail points to something larger than procurement. It suggests Ukraine was beginning to manage ground robotics through a structured cycle of planning, execution, measurement, and growth. For a country fighting a larger opponent in a long war of attrition, that shift is strategic. It means machines are no longer being introduced one by one. They are being organized and scaled as part of the wider war effort. What stands out most is not simply the hardware itself, but the pattern behind its use. Ukraine is showing that ground robotics can be standardized, tracked, and expanded across a war effort. Once mission numbers rise this quickly, the question is no longer how many robots Ukraine has. The more important question is what work those machines are taking away from soldiers at the front. The first real battlefield value of Ukraine's unmanned ground vehicles was not firepower. It was the simple task of moving supplies in places where movement itself had become deadly. As drones spread across the sky, even short trips to the front started to carry a level of risk once linked mainly to assault operations. Food, water, ammunition, batteries, and medical kits still had to reach forward positions, but every exposed route could now be watched from above. That changed the logic of logistics. A resupply mission was no longer just a support task. It became a survival problem. In that environment, a machine could take the first risk instead of a soldier. That is why UGVs found their earliest role in logistics. This is what gave ground robots practical value in the early phase of deployment. They reduced direct human exposure in the most repeated and dangerous tasks near the line of contact. Instead of asking soldiers to carry loads through routes that could be tracked by Russian drones, Ukrainian units could send robotic platforms forward with supplies. The loss of a machine was serious, but it was not equal to the loss of trained manpower. In areas such as Pokrovsk, where pressure remained intense and drone activity was heavy, ground robots became part of the system that kept frontline positions functioning. They were not used there as an interesting experiment. They were used because men still needed ammunition and food, and because ordinary delivery methods were becoming too costly. This is why logistics became the first foundation of battlefield robotization. This mattered not only for safety, but also for tempo. Frontline units cannot hold ground if routine supply breaks down, even when no major offensive is underway. A robot that completes one delivery run may keep a position viable for another day. The same pattern appeared in casualty evacuation, where pressure on human teams was often even more severe. A wounded soldier near the front does not face only blood loss or shock. He also faces time, distance, broken terrain, and constant observation from above. Any rescue team moving toward him may become a target as well. That is what made evacuation one of the clearest uses for UGVs. A ground robot could move into a dangerous zone, carry a wounded soldier back over part of the route, and reduce the number of people who had to enter that area. It could not replace a medic, and it could not solve every problem created by artillery, mud, or damaged roads. But it could shorten the most dangerous segment of the journey. That alone could save lives. Taken together, logistics and casualty evacuation explain why these tasks became the starting point of Ukraine's ground robot effort. Both missions are constant. Both consume manpower every day. And both create losses even when no major attack is taking place. A system that protects resupply routes and helps retrieve the wounded does more than make the front more efficient. It preserves combat strength over time. That is especially important for Ukraine because a long war punishes armies not only through dramatic battles, but through daily attrition in ordinary tasks. The early story of UGVs is therefore not mainly about spectacle or futuristic imagery. It is about the mathematics of survival in a battlefield where every visible movement carries danger. Once a machine proves that it can keep supplies flowing and pull wounded men out with less human exposure, its role is unlikely to remain limited. A technology that secures the rear edge of the front line will eventually be pushed closer to direct contact. That practical effect gave commanders a reason to expand use step by step. Confidence grows faster when a technology solves ordinary problems every day, not when it delivers one dramatic but rare success. After proving their value in logistics and casualty evacuation, Ukraine's unmanned ground vehicles began taking on a more dangerous task: direct combat support near the point of contact. This was a major shift in battlefield use. It meant these machines were no longer limited to carrying supplies or pulling wounded men away from danger. They were starting to move toward enemy positions themselves. It is reported that Ukraine had organized robotic units for attack, defense, mining, demoning, logistics, and casualty evacuation. That list matters because it shows a wider change in military thinking. Ground robots were no longer treated as simple transport tools. They were becoming part of a broader combat system designed to help units reach, pressure, and disrupt enemy positions with less immediate human exposure. This shift answered a very practical battlefield problem. The first approach to a trench, ruin, or hidden firing point is often the most dangerous moment for infantry. A soldier has to move into uncertainty before he can fully understand what is waiting ahead. A UGV can take that first risk instead. It can be sent forward under remote control, test the enemy's reaction, and force defenders to reveal their position before friendly troops move closer. That changes the order of danger. Men do not have to be the first body entering every threat zone. Instead, a machine can move first, gather a response, and help commanders judge whether the enemy position is active, defended, or vulnerable. In a war shaped by constant observation and fast strikes, that sequence matters. The machines used for these missions are not identical, and that is part of their value. Some platforms carry machine guns for suppression. Others carry mines or explosive charges meant to strike a hidden position without sending an assault team in first. The source material gives a clear example. In one Ukrainian operation, a UGV reportedly carried 12 mines over a distance of about 20 kilometers and delivered them into a ruined structure where Russian troops were hiding. The importance of that mission was not only the final blast. The real point was that a machine could travel a long route, approach a concealed target, and deliver destructive force without requiring soldiers to make the same approach under threat. That turns the robot into more than a support device. It becomes a tool for tactical penetration. This is also why UGVs are different from traditional ground vehicles. A normal combat vehicle is built around crew survival, armor, and constant movement. A robot can operate by another logic. It can move quietly, wait in cover, remain expendable, and approach a target in ways that would be unacceptable for a manned platform. It also reported that Khartia Brigade carried out a remote-controlled ground assault using machine gun-armed vehicles together with mining and demining systems. That shows Ukraine is not simply attaching weapons to small machines. It is beginning to combine several robotic functions into one battlefield action. This matters because modern combat often rewards the side that can expose less manpower during the first contact and still create pressure. It also gives commanders more options in the first seconds of an engagement, when uncertainty is highest and mistakes are often punished before assault teams can adjust their movement. Ground robots are not replacing infantry, and they are not ending close combat. What they are changing is who absorbs the first burst of risk when a position must be approached, tested, or disrupted. That is a meaningful tactical shift. Ukraine's unmanned ground vehicles are no longer limited to supply runs, casualty evacuation, or direct combat support. They are now moving into emergency tasks outside combat, and that shift says a great deal about the nature of modern war. Once a machine proves it can enter a dangerous space instead of a person, commanders begin to ask a broader question. They ask not only where a robot can fight, but where it can protect lives after an attack. That is why the firefighting robot used in Kramatorsk matters. According to the Kyiv Independent, Ukrainian soldiers used a ZMI unmanned ground vehicle to help extinguish a fire in a residential area after a Russian strike, and they chose that method after discovering gas canisters at the scene. This was not simply a technical demonstration. It showed that ground robotics in Ukraine are beginning to serve a wider survival function inside a war zone. The significance of that incident goes beyond one fire in one city. It shows that any environment judged too dangerous for direct human action can become a space where a UGV takes the first risk. In a war shaped by drone strikes, shelling, damaged infrastructure, and repeated attacks on cities, that kind of environment is not unusual. It is part of daily life. A robot used in such conditions is not there to carry ammunition or approach a trench. It is there to enter a zone where heat, debris, explosions, toxic smoke, or renewed attack could threaten rescue teams. That changes the meaning of the platform. The machine is no longer defined only by combat value. It becomes part of emergency response. That opens the door to wider uses, including rescue support, site inspection, engineering tasks, hazardous clearance, and work in areas where the first minutes after a strike are often the most dangerous. The core logic remains the same. A machine enters first, absorbs uncertainty first, and allows people to follow only when the risk becomes more manageable. This matters because modern war is not defined only by trench assaults and artillery exchanges. It is also defined by what happens after impact, when soldiers, civilians, and emergency teams must operate inside damaged neighborhoods under continuing threat. A robot that can function in that environment becomes part of resilience, not only part of combat power. That is the larger meaning of Ukraine's expanding UGV role. The country is no longer treating ground robots as a narrow category of battlefield tool. It is starting to treat them as a multi-role platform that can support survival across different layers of war. That includes the front line, but it also includes urban crisis response and the effort to keep basic functions alive after strikes. In that sense, the spread of UGVs into emergency missions is not a side story. It is a sign that Ukraine is adapting robotics to the full reality of a long war. It suggests Ukraine now sees robotics as a way to preserve response capacity in cities that remain vulnerable even after strikes. Once robots appear in logistics, combat support, and rescue work, the issue is no longer the novelty of the technology. The larger question becomes why Ukraine feels such urgency to expand it now, and what pressure inside the war is forcing that acceleration. Ukraine's growing investment in unmanned ground vehicles is closely tied to a manpower problem that has deepened as the war has continued. After years of fighting, pressure on the armed forces is no longer measured only in battlefield losses. It is also visible in fatigue, recruitment strain, and the difficulty of keeping units effective over long periods. Reports indicate that the military has faced large-scale desertions and widespread draft avoidance, with hundreds of thousands leaving service and millions avoiding mobilization. These figures point to a structural challenge rather than a temporary issue. They show that Ukraine is trying to sustain a long war while protecting a limited pool of trained personnel. In such conditions, every decision about risk, exposure, and task assignment becomes more important. Manpower is no longer treated as an expendable resource. It is treated as something that must be preserved wherever possible. This is where unmanned ground vehicles take on strategic meaning beyond their technical role. These systems are being designed and deployed to carry out tasks that would otherwise expose soldiers to constant danger. They can support supply movement, assist in dangerous approach routes, and reduce the need to send personnel into areas under continuous observation. The key point is not that machines replace human judgment or leadership. The key point is that machines can absorb part of the physical risk that used to fall entirely on soldiers. When a robot moves forward first, it shifts the burden of uncertainty away from people. That shift may seem small in one operation, but across hundreds or thousands of missions, it changes the overall cost of maintaining a fighting force. Instead of losing trained individuals in routine tasks, the military can preserve them for roles that cannot be replaced by machines. This effect becomes critical in a war of attrition, where strength is worn down not only by major battles, but by repeated daily activity. Supply runs, casualty recovery, and movement near the front line all consume manpower even when no large-scale attack is taking place. A system that reduces risk in these routine tasks slows the rate at which units lose people over time. That allows commanders to rotate forces more effectively and manage fatigue in a more controlled way. It also helps maintain continuity inside units, which is essential for coordination and combat performance. For a country facing a larger opponent, that advantage carries strategic weight. It helps explain why ground robots are no longer treated as experimental tools, but as part of a long-term approach to sustaining the war effort. In this sense, the expansion of UGV use is not just about technology entering the battlefield. It is about protecting the human foundation of the military itself. Once a system proves that it can reduce losses and extend the life of a fighting force, its expansion becomes difficult to avoid. The most visible side of a UGV is its firepower, but its deeper strategic value lies in what it helps Ukraine preserve. Ukraine does not enjoy the manpower cushion that Russia can draw on over time, so every tool that reduces direct exposure carries lasting importance. In that setting, a ground robot is not simply a machine that moves supplies or approaches danger. It is also a way to keep soldiers away from tasks that are necessary, repeated, and highly exposed. That changes the meaning of the platform. Its value cannot be measured only by what it destroys. It also has to be measured by what it helps Ukraine avoid losing. When a robot takes over part of a resupply run, part of a casualty evacuation, or part of a dangerous approach near enemy positions, fewer people have to absorb that risk directly. In a long war, that matters. Losses are not measured only in the dead. They are also measured in the wounded, the exhausted, and the experienced soldiers who can no longer remain effective at the front. This is where UGVs begin to matter at the level of endurance. They help preserve infantry strength by taking over tasks that would otherwise drain people through constant exposure. They also give commanders more room to manage limited personnel under pressure. A unit that sends fewer soldiers into routine danger has a better chance of preserving experience, cohesion, and combat readiness over time. That effect may not create dramatic images, but it carries real military weight. In a conflict shaped by attrition, even modest reductions in daily exposure can accumulate into a larger reserve of usable strength after weeks and months of fighting. That gives Ukraine more flexibility to hold lines, rotate troops, and preserve specialists whose loss would be harder to replace quickly when pressure rises on several sectors. Ground robots do not solve Ukraine's manpower problem by themselves. What they do is make that problem less severe. They stretch limited personnel further, reduce the burden on exhausted troops, and help keep positions functioning with fewer human losses. That is why their strategic value lies beyond weapons alone. They are becoming tools for force preservation as much as tools for battlefield action. For Ukraine, that distinction is critical because keeping soldiers alive is part of maintaining the army's ability to fight tomorrow, as well as today, and across multiple sectors. What is taking shape in Ukraine is not the disappearance of soldiers from the battlefield, but a steady transfer of dangerous ground tasks from people to machines. That shift matters because it changes how endurance is built in a long war. Ground robots are now doing more than supporting isolated missions. They are becoming part of a wider method for keeping units supplied, reducing exposure, and applying pressure in places where human movement is increasingly costly. If that pattern continues, Russia's manpower advantage may face a different kind of challenge. It may be weakened not by one decisive strike, but by a slower process in which Ukraine reduces losses, preserves combat strength, and forces the battlefield to operate on new terms. In that sense, Ukraine is not simply adding another tool to the war. It is helping redefine how ground warfare may function under constant surveillance and attrition over time. If this report helped you better understand the war, subscribe to Military Force for more clear and responsible analysis of modern conflict, weapons, and global politics. Military Force is here to inform and educate, not to glorify destruction, because every battle carries a human cost that should never be ignored. Stay with Military Force to keep learning about war with deeper knowledge, sharper perspective, and greater respect for peace.